He stalked his victims in the shadows, tied them up, and slaughtered them in their own homes, left a trail of tortured victims across Montana. But when Wayne Nance broke into one couple's house, he didn't know his final victim would be the one to kill him. What really happened that night? And how many others did he murder before the truth came out? One man's fight for survival would end a serial killer's reign and uncover a web of unsolved murders that still haunt investigators to this day. Hey there, and welcome new and returning viewers to the channel. I'm so glad you're here. I started this true crime series with a big dream, to hit 5,000 subscribers by the end of the year. I know that's a tough goal, but with your help, I truly believe it's possible. Every time you watch a video to the end, leave a comment, hit like, or share it with someone. It really does make a difference. I'm here to bring you the most compelling, chilling, and deeply human stories, and I want this to be a space where we think, feel, and question together. So if you enjoy what you see, please consider subscribing and coming back for more. There's so much still to uncover. Today's case is about Wayne Nance, the so-called Missoula Mauler, a man who lived a double life as a furniture mover by day and a sadistic predator by night. His final attack on an unsuspecting couple would expose a trail of terror spanning over a decade. This is the story of how a serial killer was brought down, not by law enforcement, but by the sheer will to survive. Wayne Nathan Nance was born on October 18, 1955, in the small town of Clinton, Montana, a remote logging town tucked between rugged mountains and wide rivers. It's a quiet speck in the rugged wilderness just east of Missoula. He came into a world still nursing the aftershocks of World War II and entering the chill of the Cold War. His father, George, was a long-haul trucker, often gone for long stretches of time, while his mother, Charlene, worked as a waitress in nearby Milltown. She was tired, overworked, and increasingly detached from her son. Theirs was a blue-collar household in a country bracing against inflation, civil unrest, and cultural upheaval. Their life, like many rural families in post-war America, was one of hard work and quiet strain. Wayne grew up in the 1960s, when America was gripped by the Vietnam War, the assassinations of JFK and Martin Luther King Jr., and a youth counterculture that rejected conformity. But in rural Montana, far from the nation's headlines, Nance's childhood unfolded in relative obscurity. The Nances lived in a motorhome, modest and cramped, on the outskirts of town. These weren't the golden years of suburban prosperity that so much of 1950s America celebrated. This was small-town Montana, a place where poverty, isolation, and generational trauma festered quietly beneath the surface. As Wayne grew into adolescence during the 1960s and 70s, America itself was in turmoil. The Vietnam War raged overseas, civil rights protests erupted in cities, and the Manson family murders had cast a dark shadow over the national psyche. For boys like Wayne, the television flickered between images of war, counterculture rebellion, and bloody crime scenes. Meanwhile, at school, teachers described him as bright but offbeat. He was academically gifted, but unnervingly intense. Friends later remembered his disturbing fixation on Satanism, his self-branding with hot coat hangers, and his haunting declaration that he wanted to kill before he turned 19. By high school, Wayne Nance had already begun to spiral. He graduated from Sentinel High in 1974, the same year Donna Pounds was brutally murdered just miles from his home. Though no charges stuck, the suspicion was real. After graduation, Nance enlisted in the U.S. Navy, where he served until 1977, but even that structure couldn't hold him. He was discharged for misconduct, caught with drugs, stolen items, and illegal weapons. Wherever Nance went, he carried with him a quiet chaos, one that would only grow louder, more violent, and more deadly with time. His upbringing was shaped by an America teetering between tradition and upheaval. He was a child of a fractured home, a witness to a nation in cultural crisis, and a product of a decade that blurred the lines between rebellion and destruction. And in Wayne's case, destruction won. Perhaps the cruelest truth of all is this: monsters aren't born, they're built slowly, in silence, in shadows. And if no one's watching, they grow bold. First kill. In the months leading up to his first suspected murder, Wayne Nance was teetering on the edge of darkness. It was early 1974 in Missoula, Montana, a quiet, wooded community where people still left their doors unlocked and neighbors waved from their porches. But under the surface of that calm, 18-year-old Nance was unraveling. Fresh out of Sentinel High School, he wasn't heading to college or chasing dreams. Instead, he spent his time drifting between his motorhome in Milltown and the homes of friends, often lurking on the fringes of families who trusted him. One of those families was the Pounds. Donna Pounds, a 39-year-old mother and part-time Christian bookstore employee, lived with her husband and teenage son in West Riverside. Nance had become close to her son and was a frequent presence around the house. He had even been shown where the family kept their firearms, a chilling detail that would later take on devastating significance. By spring of that year, Nance was already voicing fantasies of violence. He bragged to peers about satanic rituals, carved occult symbols into his skin, and obsessed over the idea of taking a life before turning 19. Then, on April 11, 1974, it happened. Donna came home in the afternoon, unaware that Nance was waiting for her. Armed with her husband's own Luger .22 caliber pistol and carrying a black gym bag filled with rope and gloves, he tied her to the bed, raped her, and dragged her to the basement. There, with a detached brutality, he shot her 5 times in the back of the head. He desecrated her body with the gun, wiped down what he could, and disappeared into the fading light of that Montana day. Witnesses saw him in the area. One even claimed he left the Pounds residence, carrying the same black gym bag he was known for. But the case stalled. With no concrete evidence, Nance walked free. This was the moment the line was crossed, from dark fantasy to real-world violence. And no one knew it yet, but Missoula had just welcomed a serial killer into its shadows. Second murder. After the brutal and unsolved murder of Donna Pounds in 1974, Wayne Nance slipped quietly out of suspicion and deeper into a life marked by transience, secrecy, and an increasingly dangerous psychological descent. In the years that followed, he joined the U.S. Navy, serving from 1974 to 1977. But rather than reforming his troubled tendencies, the military seemed to give him new cover and new opportunities. He traveled widely, moving from base to base, and was eventually discharged for misconduct. Drugs, stolen property, and illegal weapons ended his service, and he returned to Montana in the late 1970s, with few prospects and even fewer boundaries. By 1980, Nance had taken a job as a bouncer at a local bar in Missoula, and was living once again on the outskirts of society. He was no longer the kid fresh out of high school, but a man now hardened by secrecy and rejection. Around this time, a 15-year-old girl named Devonna Nelson vanished from Seattle. A runaway and considered vulnerable, Nelson had likely crossed paths with Nance during his travels or while hitching rides, something common among lost and exploited teens in that era. She somehow made her way to Montana, and that's where her story ended. What happened between Devonna and Wayne Nance has never been fully reconstructed, but the discovery of her body tells a horrific tale. On February 27, 1980, her badly decomposed remains were found near a chain-link fence by a freight train crew on a road bank near Interstate 90, just outside of Missoula. She was barefoot, her dress pulled up around her neck, with no shoes or underwear, and a stab wound to the chest. For years, her identity remained unknown, and she was given the placeholder name Betty Beavertail, named after the nearby state park. It wasn't until 1985, 5 years later, that forensic identification confirmed her real name, Devonna Nelson. Though there was no direct forensic evidence linking Nance to her murder, the timing, location, and victim profile fit disturbingly well with his evolving pattern. A young, isolated female, brutal, sexually motivated violence, disposal in a remote location. Nance at this time was building a life that seemed, on the surface, unremarkable. But behind closed doors, he was beginning to stalk, hunt, and eliminate young women who crossed his path. The murder of Devonna Nelson was never solved, but in the context of what we now know about Wayne Nance, it is widely believed to be his second kill. And as with many of his crimes, it would take years and his own violent death before investigators would start to piece it all together. In 1980, though there were no alarms, no headline splash, just another runaway girl found discarded in the wilderness, her killer still roaming free. Third murder. By the fall of 1984, Wayne Nance had grown bolder. No longer satisfied with random encounters or fleeting obsessions, he began weaving his victims directly into his daily life. One of them was Marcella Marcy Bachman. a 16-year-old runaway from Vancouver, Washington. Marcy had left home following intense conflict with her family, particularly her stepfather, and like many vulnerable teens of the time, she was easy prey. She met Nance after being dropped off by a trucker in Missoula, Montana, cold, alone, and looking for shelter. Nance, who now worked for a local furniture company and was known for helping people move, offered her a place to stay. She accepted, unaware she had just stepped into the orbit of a serial killer. Marcy, going by the alias Robin, told locals she was from Texas or had passed through there, classic signs of a girl trying to blur her trail. She stayed in Nance's home, just a couple of miles from where her body would later be found. He introduced her to others as a friend or someone he was helping, but it soon became clear he was obsessed with controlling her. When asked what happened to Robin, Nance gave inconsistent stories. She ran off with a trucker. He'd put her on a bus. She vanished on her own. But he never filed a missing persons report. He never looked for her, because the truth was far more sinister. In reality, Marcy never left. On or around September 28, 1984, she was murdered, shot 3 times in the head and buried in a shallow grave near Deer Creek, just outside Missoula. Months later, in December 1984, a wildlife photographer stumbled upon her remains, her decomposing leg protruding from the frozen earth. She was dubbed Debbie Deer Creek, another Jane Doe in a long line of forgotten victims. Her real identity would remain a mystery until 2006, when DNA technology finally confirmed who she was. Nance's connection to the crime was chilling. When police eventually searched his home after his death, they found photo booth pictures of him and Marcy, along with a strand of her hair in his truck. His lies, his calculated manipulation, and the proximity of her burial site to his home painted a picture of premeditated murder. Unlike his earlier suspected kills, this one was deeply personal. He had lived with her, groomed her, lied about her, and when she no longer served whatever twisted fantasy he was playing out, he eliminated her. Marcy Bachman's story reflects a heartbreaking pattern seen far too often in true crime. A runaway seeking safety, only to be swallowed by the very darkness she hoped to escape. In Wayne Nance's world, kindness was a trap, and trust was a death sentence. 4th, murder. By the time Wayne Nance crossed paths with his 4th known victim, he was already seasoned in the art of manipulation, control, and cold-blooded murder. It was sometime between 1983 and 1985 when Janet Lee Lucas, a 23-year-old mother from Sandpoint, Idaho, vanished without a trace. Janet had been struggling in life, disconnected from her roots in Spokane, Washington, and reportedly dealing with personal hardships that made her vulnerable to predators like Nance. She was likely hitchhiking or traveling through western Montana when she encountered him. The exact moment they met is still a mystery, but what is known is that she never made it back home. Wayne Nance was working at the time, still hiding in plain sight in Missoula, and sharpening his predatory instincts. He had learned how to spot weakness, how to pick out the drifters, the runaways, the women whose disappearances wouldn't set off national alarms. Janet fit the profile. Her body wouldn't be discovered until September 11, 1985, when a hunter found a skeleton near Crystal Creek, just 3 miles from where Nance had buried Marcella Bachman the year before. Her remains were so degraded that investigators could only say she had been killed by 2.32 caliber bullets to the head. Dental work suggested she had traveled or lived abroad, and for decades, she was known only as Christy Crystal Creek, another faceless casualty of the Missoula Mauler. Although there were no living witnesses and no forensic evidence directly tying Nance to her murder, the similarities were too strong to ignore. The proximity of her body to other known victims, the nature of her wounds, and the pattern of targeting transient young women all pointed to him. After Nance's death in 1986, police began matching pieces from old cases, and Janet's name eventually resurfaced. It wasn't until 2021, thanks to genetic genealogy, that Christy Crystal Creek was finally identified as Janet Lee Lucas, giving closure to a family that had waited almost 40 years for answers. Wayne Nance likely saw Janet as disposable, a nameless traveler who wouldn't be missed. But what he didn't count on was that science would one day give her back her name, and that the web he left behind would eventually unravel. Janet wasn't just another victim. She was a mother, a daughter, a woman with a life that mattered. In the world of true crime, it's easy to focus on the monster. But it's the stories of the lost, reclaimed through time and truth, that carry the weight of justice. Fifth murder. By late 1985, Wayne Nance had fully embraced the darkness he'd once only hinted at as a disturbed teen. No longer content with isolated victims or chance encounters, he began targeting entire families, staging home invasions with calculated violence and sadistic control. That path led him to Michael and Teresa Shook, a young couple living in Ravalli County, Montana, with their 4 children. On December 12, 1985, Nance came to their home armed and ready, introducing himself as Conan the Barbarian, a twisted display of bravado that masked a far more disturbing agenda. Nance had been in the Shook's home just days earlier as a furniture delivery man, a routine part of his job at Conlon's Furniture. He used these jobs to study his victims, to assess the layout of their homes, and perhaps most chillingly, to decide if they were worth killing. Teresa Shook, 32, and Michael Shook, 34, were a loving, hard-working couple whose lives revolved around raising their children. They had no idea that the man who brought their new couch would return with a gun. That night, at around 9 p.m., Nance forced his way in, shot Teresa in the leg, likely unintentionally, and tied up both Michael and Teresa as their children watched in terror. He locked the 4 kids in a bedroom, sealing them off from the horrors that unfolded just beyond the door. Nance beat Michael and tied him to a post in the basement, stabbing him in the chest and leaving him to die. He dragged Teresa upstairs, tied her to the bed, raped her, and then stabbed her to death, covering her face with a pillow, an act often associated with depersonalization in sexually motivated murders. But Nance wasn't done. He returned to the house later that night and attempted to destroy the evidence by setting a fire. Though the flames didn't spread, the materials he used released cyanide gas into the airtight home, endangering the children. By pure luck and the fast actions of concerned neighbors, the children survived. Later, a search of Nance's home revealed stolen items from the Shook residence, including a distinctive stag-handled hunting knife, a silver dollar collection, and an elk statue. These trophies were more than just souvenirs. They were evidence of a killer who relished his work. In the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, in a quiet Montana county, Wayne Nance escalated to full-scale domestic terrorism. The Shook family tragedy was the ultimate embodiment of his method. Gain trust, strike with overwhelming force, and vanish. But unlike earlier cases, this time there were survivors. 4 young children lived to tell a story they never should have had to endure, and their testimony, though too young to remember all the details, helped investigators link Nance to the growing pattern of horror. In Wayne Nance's world, even kindness, like opening the door for a furniture delivery, could be fatal. And in homes meant to be safe havens, he turned bedrooms and basements into crime scenes. By the summer of 1986, Wayne Nance was no longer hiding the predator he had become. He was feeding it. The pattern of violence was accelerating, and behind his quiet job at Conlon's Furniture in Missoula, Montana, Nance was spiraling toward his final, fatal act. His next target wasn't a stranger. It was someone he saw every day. Kris Wells was a manager at the store, a confident, respected woman who had caught Nance's attention months earlier. But this wasn't just infatuation, it was obsession. He began stalking her, photographing her without her knowledge, even collecting images of her jogging from the bushes. In his wallet, he kept photos of Kris, along with handwritten notes like "I love you" and "I want you to live with me." Wayne Nance believed that Kris owed him something, her attention, her affection, maybe even her life. And in his twisted mind, whatever rejection or imagined slight she represented had to be punished. On the night of September 3, 1986, Nance parked outside Kris's home in Missoula, where she lived with her husband, Doug Wells. Lurking in the shadows, he waited until Doug noticed something outside, a suspicious figure by the bushes. When Doug stepped out to investigate, Nance approached him with a story about spotting a prowler. He asked to borrow a flashlight. As Doug led him back inside, Nance struck, clubbing Doug in the head with a blunt object and quickly overpowering him. Inside the home, Nance tied up both Doug and Kris. He dragged Doug to the basement, stabbing him in the chest and leaving him to die tied to a post. Then he went upstairs to assault Kris, but Doug wasn't dead. Bleeding and in agony, he managed to free himself and reach an antique rifle he had kept near his workbench. He loaded a single round. Rather than risk Nance using Kris as a human shield, Doug slammed the rifle butt against the wall to draw him out. The plan worked. Nance ran to the stairs, where Doug pulled the trigger and shot him in the side. What followed was a brutal, desperate fight for survival. Kris freed herself enough to join the struggle. Doug and Nance exchanged blows. Nance managed to fire 2 shots from his own pistol. One missed, the other struck Doug above the knee. But it wasn't enough. Doug kept fighting, smashing Nance with the broken rifle until the killer collapsed. In a final moment of strength, Doug grabbed Nance's pistol and shot him in the head. Wayne Nance died hours later in the hospital. In the aftermath, police found alarming evidence in his home: trophies from previous murders, photos of victims, weapons, and notes that connected him to 5 unsolved killings across Montana. The Wells case would be his final attempt and his ultimate undoing. This wasn't just another tragic home invasion. It was the last stand of a killer who had evaded justice for over a decade, and this time, his victims fought back. Police investigation and capture. For over a decade, Wayne Nance haunted Montana like a ghost, always nearby, always suspicious, but never quite within the grasp of the law. Investigators knew someone was preying on young women and vulnerable families. They had bodies. They had bullet casings, crime scenes, and chilling evidence. But what they didn't have, what always seemed just out of reach, was a name. The murders were spaced out across counties, and with no national database at the time, and no DNA technology as we know it today, connecting the dots was nearly impossible. In the 1970s and early 1980s, police departments were siloed, information moved slowly, and serial crime was still a relatively misunderstood concept in law enforcement. When Donna Pounds was murdered in 1974, suspicion circled around Nance early. He was a known friend of her son. He had access to the house. Witnesses even placed him near the property that day, carrying a black gym bag. A glove was found at the scene, but forensic science wasn't advanced enough to definitively link it to him. Without a confession or solid physical evidence, detectives were forced to let him go. Then the trail went cold. Over the next several years, as other women like Devonna Nelson, Marcella Bachman, and Janet Lee Lucas were found murdered and buried in the wilderness near Missoula. Law enforcement suspected foul play, but couldn't make the critical connections. The victims had no clear ties to each other. They were runaways, transients, young women lost in the shuffle of the American underbelly, and their killer remained invisible. Even after the 1985 double homicide of Michael and Teresa Shook, where Nance left behind stolen items and nearly gassed 4 children to death, investigators didn't yet know the scope of what they were facing. The clues were there: trophies missing from the home, a botched arson attempt, and a disturbing level of control over the victims. But the name Wayne Nance still didn't sit at the top of any suspect list. He was just a mover, a guy who delivered couches, quiet, unassuming. That all changed on September 3, 1986. When Nance invaded the Wells home and attempted to murder Doug and Kris Wells, the plan went disastrously wrong. After being stabbed and left for dead in the basement, Doug managed to free himself, shoot Nance with an antique rifle, and, with Kris's help, fight the killer off until he lay convulsing on the floor, mortally wounded. When police arrived, the crime scene was chaotic and brutal. Blood streaked the walls. Restraints littered the house. But most importantly, the attacker was still alive, barely. Nance was taken to the hospital, but died the next day from his injuries. It wasn't until investigators began digging into Nance's home that the real horror unfolded. Inside, they found physical evidence linking him to the Shook murders: a hunting knife, a silver dollar collection, an elk statue, all stolen from the Shook residence. There were photo booth pictures of Nance and Marcella Bachman, whose remains had been found 2 years earlier. Strands of her hair were found in his truck. Investigators also discovered detailed, disturbing notes and photos of Kris Wells, indicating a long-standing obsession. The profile matched. The timeline matched. For the first time, authorities had not just a suspect, but a suspect whose death unlocked the truth behind several previously unsolved homicides. Yet the capture of Wayne Nance wasn't the result of a break in a traditional investigation. He wasn't caught through surveillance, confession, or a sting. He was caught because he picked the wrong target. It was Doug and Kris Wells, two ordinary people in an extraordinary moment, who ended the reign of one of Montana's most elusive serial killers. In many ways, the police didn't capture Wayne Nance, his victims did. And perhaps that's the final, ironic twist of this story. The law couldn't reach him, but justice still found a way. The end. After Wayne Nance succumbed to his injuries on September 4th, 1986, the Missoula County Sheriff's Office launched one of the most intensive post-mortem investigations in Montana's history. It didn't take long for them to realize they weren't just dealing with a failed home invasion. They had stumbled upon the long-sought key to a string of unsolved murders spanning more than a decade. Nance had never been formally charged, tried, or convicted during his life, but his death cracked open a vault of long-buried secrets. Inside his modest home and camper, investigators discovered a chilling array of trophies and evidence. Items belonging to the Shook family were brutally murdered just months earlier were found neatly stored. An elk statue, a hunting knife, a coin collection. They uncovered photographs of Kris Wells, some taken from the bushes during her jogs, and a disturbing personal album of handwritten notes professing his obsession. Most damning of all, they found hair samples and photo booth pictures connecting Nance to Marcy Bachman, whose body had been found buried in a shallow grave near his home in 1984. As police re-examined old cases, a chilling pattern emerged. Crime scene reports were reopened. Case files once believed cold were now seen through a new lens. Nance's military record was reviewed, raising questions about whether he may have killed during his Navy service, particularly when he visited cities like Seattle, coinciding with the disappearance of Devonna Nelson, a 15-year-old runaway whose body was found outside Missoula in 1980. Although some connections remained circumstantial, the cumulative weight of the evidence was staggering. Law enforcement unofficially attributed at least 6 murders to Nance, though many believe the true number could be higher. With DNA testing still in its infancy, many winks remain suggestive, not definitive. As for Wayne Nance's family, very little has been publicly documented in the years since his death. His father, George Nance, a long-haul trucker, and his mother, Charlene, who had died 6 years prior in 1980, were known to have lived modestly in a motorhome with their son during his youth. There's no public record of statements made by his father following Wayne's death. And if the family did respond to the revelations, they did so privately and out of the public eye. It's believed that his family had little knowledge of the depth of his crimes, though some in Missoula have quietly speculated whether warning signs were missed or ignored. Wayne Nance was never handcuffed, never read his rights, never stood trial. Yet, through the blood and bravery of Doug and Kris Wells, the truth came to light. In a cruel twist of fate, his death, violent and chaotic, just like the lives he ended, became the moment that finally gave closure to the victims he had silenced for so long. In the end, Nance's story serves as a dark reminder. Monsters can live next door, wear uniforms, deliver your furniture, and smile while hiding the worst of intentions. And sometimes, justice doesn't arrive in a courtroom. It kicks down the door and fights back. Wayne Nance was a serial predator who haunted Montana for over a decade, hiding in plain sight as a furniture mover while committing some of the state's most chilling murders. His victims were often vulnerable young women and trusting families, people who opened their doors to kindness and were met with unimaginable cruelty. Among them were Donna Pounds, a mother and Christian bookstore worker, Marcella Bachman, a runaway teenager seeking safety, and Michael and Teresa Shook, loving parents whose lives were stolen in front of their children. These were real people with dreams, families, and futures that mattered. For years, their cases remained unsolved, their stories paused in grief and unanswered questions. But in 1986, when Nance tried to murder Doug and Kris Wells, he met resistance he hadn't counted on. Resistance that ultimately ended his killing spree. In the aftermath, investigators finally began to piece together the trail of devastation Nance left behind, giving names back to Jane Does and closure to families who had long suffered in silence. This story is not just about a monster exposed. but about the enduring strength of the human spirit, the courage of survivors, the persistence of investigators, and the sacred memory of those who were taken too soon.